Thank you so much for being here this evening. My name is Penny Wright. I'm in charge of adult programs here, and so I've had the opportunity to listen to many speakers over the years. And I have to tell you that the gentleman whom you will be hearing today, in my opinion, is one of the best we've had. And actually, this is his fourth visit here. His name is Michael Barnhart. Dr. Barnhart is a distinguished teaching professor in the history department at Stony Brook University. Since earning his doctorate from Harvard in 1980, he has written or edited 3 books, including Japan Prepares for Total War, The Search for Economic Security, 1919 to 1941, Japan and the World since 1868, Congress and U.S. Foreign Policy, Controlling the Use of Force in the Nuclear Age. He has also written over 24 articles and book chapters on the history of international relations and nearly 50 book reviews in various professional journals. He has temporarily suspended his work on a lengthy survey, which is entitled E Pluribus, A Political History of American Foreign Relations from Jamestown to Obama, while he is completing a book which is tentatively titled Can You Beat Churchill? Using Simulations to Teach History. And we hope that he will accept another invitation to talk about that book when it is published. Please welcome Dr. Michael Barnhart.
Thank you very much, Penny, and thank all of you for having me back and for coming out on a day when we all probably should be outside doing something else. Well, today I'm talking about, well, in a way, an anniversary. In about 3 weeks, it'll be 74 years since the last time an atomic weapon was used in anger. And I'm not here to talk about what's going to happen in the next 74 years. That's why I'm a historian. But I am going to share with you my thoughts about why we have not used atomic weapons over the past 74 years. And to that end, I'm going to give you 2 broad theories that aren't particularly popular among historians, but have been put forward by political scientists, specialists in international relations, that sort of thing, to explain why there hasn't been an atomic war over the past 74 years. And then, for those of you that know the usual academic exercise, I'm going to tell you why they're wrong and give you all my details, and then end the talk with telling you what I think is right, what the correct explanation is for why we haven't blown ourselves up yet. The 2 primary theories that, as I say, political scientists have put forward are, in a way, mirror images of each other. One is simply called deterrence, and it argues that the great powers have not used nuclear weapons against each other because they all have nuclear weapons, and they're afraid that if they launch an atomic strike against someone else, that someone else will launch an atomic strike against them. The world will end as a result of that exchange, so nobody in his right mind would launch an atomic strike in the first place. This theory of deterrence has come to acquire an anagram of its own, MAD, which I think is a particularly apt anagram under the circumstances, stands for Mutually Assured Destruction. That nobody can expect to survive a nuclear exchange, and so forth. No one will ever initiate such an exchange. So that's one broad theory. That the idea of deterrence, the concept of MAD, mutually assured destruction, has ensured that we haven't had an atomic war since 1945. Second theory, really quite different, argues that the reason we haven't, that nobody has used atomic weapons since Nagasaki, is the moral issue. That atomic weapons are so morally repulsive, they're so abhorrent in the consequences of their use, not simply the sheer destructive power, but the radiation and so forth, that for simple human reasons, no human leader on the planet, regardless of where they're from, regardless of what nation they're leading, whether it's Harry Truman after Nagasaki, who resolved he would never use an atomic bomb again, or whether it was Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet Union, who saw at Chernobyl, the famous HBO series this past few months, what happened from an accidental nuclear accident, an atomic reactor. that where he says, these things are so terrible, they're so horrible that under no circumstances would we ever use them. Either that there is a nuclear taboo that exists among leaders of nations that explains why these atomic weapons have never been used. Okay, well, those are the two broad theories that are on the table. Now I'm going to get into the details of why they're wrong. I'm not going to refute them directly. I'm going to let the historical record speak for itself, because I'm going to take a look at 3 times at the brink, 3 times for very different reasons, as I think you'll see this evening, that the United States and the Soviet Union came close to a nuclear exchange. The first, probably closest time that the world came to it was in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I'd like to briefly explain why we had a missile crisis over Cuba and then why it didn't end in World War III. Ironically, the reason there was a Cuban Missile Crisis in the first place was because the Soviet Union put nuclear missiles in Cuba. So if we want to understand why there was a Cuban Missile Crisis, we have to understand why the Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, put Soviet nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba in the first place. And the reason he did that, ironically, is because mutually assured destruction was not in effect in October of 1962 when Khrushchev decided to put those missiles in. It was all United States in 1962. The Soviet Union had a total of 480 nuclear warheads in 1962. The United States had a total of 3,260. More to the point, the Soviet Union had no reliable way of delivering a single atomic warhead on American soil. The United States had B-52s already in the air on a 24-hour alert. Some of you might remember the movie Failsafe. That stems from an accidental launch code signal to those B-52s, and then the group heads into the Soviet Union and bad things happen afterwards. But the United States was also building a fleet of Polaris submarines that could launch missiles from sea that could reach the Soviet Union, and the Minuteman missile, a real technological breakthrough that, as its name implies, could be launched within a minute from bases inside the continental United States that could fly over the northern polar ice cap and land on the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union had nothing like that. And that was one big problem for Khrushchev. The United States, if it wished to do so, could probably launch a nuclear attack against the Soviet Union and get away with it. Not scot-free, of course. The Soviet Union could devastate Western Europe. Kind of a problem there. But the United States would essentially emerge unscathed. And that was an intolerable situation for Khrushchev. So one big problem Khrushchev faced in 1962 was, how can I redress the nuclear balance? How can I build a condition of mutually assured destruction? Khrushchev had tried to do so by running a bluff, by lying. He had boasted in 1959 and 1960 that the Soviet Union had already built an intercontinental ballistic missile force, something akin to the American Minuteman. And said, you know, you try to threaten us and we will launch our missiles and obliterate the United States. And unfortunately for Khrushchev, the Americans were flying U-2 reconnaissance planes directly over the Soviet Union. And really unfortunately for Khrushchev, the Soviet Union actually shot one of those down. Why is that unfortunate for the Soviet Union? Because Khrushchev saw the film that the U-2 had been taking. And the U-2 clearly, and Khrushchev knew the American leaders understood this as well, the U-2 showed that the Soviet Union had not built ICBMs. This was all a sham. And in fact, the Americans knew that they had a crushing atomic advantage over the Soviet Union. So Khrushchev, going into 1962, realized, now I have to do the real thing. And that was a second problem for Khrushchev, because building a fleet of ICBMs is expensive. It costs a lot of money. And the Soviet Union didn't have much money. This was a perennial problem for the Soviet Union, a poor country trying to compete with the United States at the height of its power when America was great. Kind of steal phrase of the air. So here's Khrushchev. He knows that his bluff has been called by the Soviet Union. He's under intense pressure from the Red Army, the Soviet armed forces. You've got to do something real this time. You've got to build a Soviet ICBM force. And it's got to be really expensive. And Khrushchev doesn't want to do that because the Soviet Union is a poor country. There are long lines to get a loaf of bread in the Soviet Union. Khrushchev realizes that. He said, what I've got to do really is invest more of the Soviet economy, a planned economy, communist economy, into delivering consumer goods, because the West is, the United States is far ahead of us in that regard. as well. So, yeah, I have to do something to address the nuclear balance, but I don't want to spend a lot of money doing that. I have consumer needs to meet. And there was yet a third problem for Khrushchev in 1962, and that was Cuba. Here was Cuba that had just gone communist. It was, for those of you too younger, Cuba was the poster child of communism. It was the only time besides the Soviet Union itself that a people had risen up spontaneously and put a communist regime in power. It wasn't like Poland, it wasn't like Czechoslovakia, it wasn't like Romania, Bulgaria. You know, communist regime put in power at the barrel of a gun of the Soviet army. No, the Cubans had done this themselves. They had done what Marx had said. That's the way communism was supposed to operate. People were supposed to say, yeah, let's vote for brink. No, wait a minute. Let's install a communist regime. Right? And they had done it. And sure enough, Fidel Castro, the communist leader, was anathema to the United States. I mean, what did the United States do just a year after Castro had taken power? They had sponsored an invasion of the Cuban exiles of the Bay of Pigs, deliberately planned to overthrow the Castro regime. It had been a fiasco. It hadn't worked. But it was clear to Khrushchev, it was even clearer to Castro, that the Americans would be back, this time not with a ragtag bunch of Cuban exiles, but with the United States Marine Corps. And Castro was not going to win that kind of fight, even though he proposed to make as hard a fight as he could. So here was Khrushchev was yet a third problem. How do I protect this poster boy, Fidel Castro, this showing example of communism, successful communism in Cuba that was supposed to serve as a model for the rest of Latin America, hopefully Africa and South Asia and the rest of the world, so that communism would win the Cold War. Three big problems. Develop restore a nuclear balance with the United States, do it cheaply, protect Castro from an American invasion. And Khrushchev thought he had the ideal solution. I'll put nuclear missiles in Cuba. These are much cheaper missiles because they have a much shorter range. We already have them in the Soviet Union right off the shelf. We don't have to build them. Right? Not a strain on the budget. And they'll be able to reach the United States. So in one fell swoop, we can create a nuclear balance. We can do it fairly cheaply, and we can protect Castro because these missiles are going to be based right in Cuba. So that was the logic behind Khrushchev's decision, and we pretty much know how this thing turned out. The U-2s were also flying over Cuba. They picked up photographs of Soviet missile bases being built in Cuba. President Kennedy went crazy, well, not literally so, but he was pretty angry about this decision. He alerted Khrushchev that, I know what you're doing. He declared an American naval blockade around Cuba to make sure that additional missiles couldn't come into Cuba, and to make a relatively long story short, he struck a deal, a very secret deal, with Khrushchev that stipulated that the Soviet Union would remove the missiles that already had been placed in Cuba, already had been before the Americans declared the blockade. Castro would remove those, infuriating Castro, incidentally, he was not consulted in this at all. The Soviets would remove the missiles, and the United States would promise not to invade Cuba. That was the deal. Well, okay, Khrushchev had successfully protected Cuba so long as he could trust the Americans. But he had done nothing to restore the nuclear balance, and he still had long-term Soviet economic problems to go. But the fact of the matter is, the world was not blown up over the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the reason I would submit to you that it was not blown up is A, forget deterrence, forget mutually assured destruction, it wasn't an operation. Khrushchev knew the instant he had one of those missiles in Cuba fired off, it was the end of the Soviet Union. The Americans would retaliate with overwhelming nuclear force. But we do have to consider the moral revulsion question. That is, why didn't Kennedy, knowing he had the upper hand in all regards, he had the Navy surrounding Cuba, he had superior nuclear balance, why didn't he go ahead and press the force? Why didn't he get rid of Castro? Quite frankly. And when you take a look at the arguments inside the Kennedy administration during the roughly 2 weeks of the Cuban Missile Crisis, you're struck by how many different alternatives were quite seriously considered. Not the naval blockade, but other alternatives. Kennedy's own Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, basically said, we shouldn't do anything. Let Castro have as many Soviet missiles as he wants. Sooner or later, the Soviets are going to build a fleet of ICBMs. Sooner or later, we are going to get to mutually assured destruction. This might hasten that day, but it doesn't change what's surely coming down the road. There's no reason to provoke, there's no reason to risk a third world war over possible miscalculation. Just let the Cubans build the missiles. Kennedy didn't think he could do that because that would be appearing weak before a communist threat. And he had seen what happened to other Democratic presidents who had appeared weak before a communist threat, like Harry Truman, who was accused of losing China in the Chinese Civil War, and he said, by God, I'm not going to be responsible for being seen as weak against the international threat of communism, a flaw that would lead his successor, Lyndon Johnson, to a place called Vietnam, and that led to a kind of different story there, but it was real political pressure that Kennedy was under. He was not going to do nothing. What was much more likelier, if you take a look at the conversations inside the Kennedy administration, was an American airstrike into Cuba to take out those missiles that were already there. Right? Why risk the possibility that the Soviets might launch if you create a naval blockade? Right? That doesn't do anything with the missiles already in place, already ready to be fired. But an American airstrike, and the United States had overwhelming air superiority over Cuba, an American airstrike could take out those missiles, and that was the favored option. The reason it was not adopted, and here would be kind of a perfect case study for moral revulsion, right? We're risking World War III, therefore it's wrong to authorize a non-nuclear airstrike against those Soviet missile bases in Cuba. And Bobby Kennedy, in fact, he turned around, he sort of hinted at that when he turned to his brother during these deliberations and said, now I know how Tojo felt when he was planning Pearl Harbor. So there's kind of a hint of, I have a few qualms about launching an airstrike. Of course, it's not a very convincing case because Tojo launched Pearl Harbor, after all. Right? And the real reason that President Kennedy didn't authorize the airstrike was the way bureaucracies work in big governments. He had to know and turned to the Air Force and said, can you assure me that you will hit 100% of these missiles? Because I don't want to authorize an airstrike, and then a couple of missiles escape it, right? And then the Soviet local commanders will do, well, the logical thing, they'll launch. They'll launch nuclear warheads against the United States. I happen to know it's 100%. And the Air Force came back and said, no, we can't promise that. 90%, promise 90%. And he said, not good enough. Well, the reason the Air Force came back with the 90% figure was the generals in the Air Force asked the colonels in the Air Force, who asked the majors in the Air Force, you should get the idea, and they, kind of opened their manuals, and they looked at the models of Soviet missiles, and the Soviet missiles are classified as mobile. So the Air Force had no doubt that it could hit what it could see, with the photographs that you two had taken. It just wasn't sure, these are mobile missiles, they could have been moved, right, in the interim. And the operating manual said, well, chances are about 10% of them could be moved, and that's why the Air Force comes back with 90%. Well, yeah, the Soviet missiles were mobile. They're mobile like a home trailer is mobile. But U.S. Air Force didn't know that, so they come back with 90%. They said, okay, we'll try the blockade instead. No more qualms at this, but thankfully, in part due to American nuclear superiority, there's no World War III in October 1962. But there might have been 11 years later, October 1973, the Yom Kippur War, or the October War. Background. By 1973, the strategic nuclear situation had radically changed. And it had radically changed precisely because of the outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev was thrown out of power because he had been weak in confronting the Americans. And his successor, Brezhnev, had said, never again will the United States have nuclear superiority over the Soviet Union. And Brezhnev says, I don't care if those bread lines get even longer. For Soviet consumers, we're going all out in a defense buildup. We're going to build a real fleet of Soviet ICBMs, and that's exactly what they had done by 1973. 1973 snapshot, the United States has a little over 9,000 nuclear warheads. The Soviet Union has nearly 3,000 nuclear warheads. And much more importantly, the Soviets have the missiles to get them into the United States. Right? The missiles can wave at each other as they go over the North Pole. Right? But you now have a condition of real mutually assured destruction. And both the Americans and the Soviets understand that. Moreover, in in 1973, not just should deterrence have worked perfectly, because there is this nuclear standoff, but Soviet-American relations overall were pretty good in 1973. It was the era of détente, of understanding between the United States and the Soviet Union, and there were good reasons for that. There were no outstanding questions in Europe. It's not a question of whether East Europe would survive as communist or West Europe would survive as non-communist. The Vietnam War was winding down, and it was pretty clear to everybody how that one was going to end. There was going to be a communist regime in Vietnam, whether the Americans liked that very much or not. There were very few other flashpoints around the world. For all intents and purposes, the Cold War was settled. It was détente. And the capstone of détente was over nuclear weapons. The United States and the Soviet Union had both agreed to a treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, that barred them, it made illegal for either the United States or the Soviet Union to construct an anti-ballistic missile system. And the reason for that was quite clear, to make sure that mad was mad. To make sure that both sides could launch strikes with full confidence that they would obliterate the other, so that both sides knew it was futile to launch the first strike in the first place. Right? The ABM, Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, was designed to enshrine deterrence, to enshrine man. And there was an agreement, although not a treaty, to limit offensive nuclear missiles at all. SALT 1 is what it's referred to in the literature, Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement. And both the United States and the Soviet Union had agreed to that. It was kind of a handshake. It wasn't a formal treaty approved by the Senate. But in June of 1973, both powers had agreed on a formal agreement on prevention of nuclear war. That was its actual name. And the agreement required urgent direct consultation between Washington and Moscow in the event of any crisis that might conceivably lead to a nuclear exchange. So both powers agreed to talk to each other before they shut their mouths off. They didn't have to quarterback that, so they didn't have to worry about foreign policy by tweet. That was the deal. And the Soviets were delighted by this because the ABM Treaty, the SALT Agreement, the very fact that there was nuclear parity meant that they had at last achieved standing on an equal level with the United States in the eyes of the world. And that was something that was just simply precious to the Soviet leaders. So why is, the second thing I'm talking about this evening, why is there a second brink in 1973? There shouldn't have been, by all odds, but there was. Because there was one region still in contention, still in play in the Cold War in 1973, and that was the Middle East. There had been, and one of the reasons why it still was in play was Israel's immense victory in, excuse me, the 1967 war, called the 6 Days War, because that's how long it lasted. It was a crushing Israeli victory that led to Israel's occupation of the Golan Heights of Syria, the West Bank of Jordan, the Sinai Peninsula of Egypt. There have been strenuous efforts since 1967 to resolve that situation. It was a situation, for our purposes, that can be simply summed up that the various Arab leaders found it intolerable. That Israel was in occupation of Arab territory and there was no foreseeable way for the Arab leaders to get them out. An intolerable situation, especially for the self-appointed leader of the Arab states, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat. Sadat remorselessly pressed the Soviet Union for military aid, top-line equipment, so that he could engage Israel at first in, you might call, a skirmish warfare. It was actually called a war of attrition, low-level battles across the Suez Canal. That's where the Israeli troops had stopped, the Suez Canal. That had escalated into larger firefights and aerial dogfights. Sadat had insisted on the best Soviet fighter planes, and later had insisted on Russian pilots to fly them against Israeli pilots. But all this had failed. It had not dislodged Israel from Sinai. And so Sadat, going into 1972, resolved on stronger measures. He threw the Soviets out of Egypt. Just threw them. And said, I'll invite you back in when you come back with even more hardware and even more advisors and even more assistance, so that I can launch a war against Israel. And the Soviets said, we don't advise you to launch a war against Israel, but we can't afford to lose Egypt as an ally in the Cold War, so we agree to all your terms. We're going to give you all the stuff you want, and you can do whatever you want with it. And that's exactly what he does, orchestrating a coordinated Arab attack against the state of Israel, beginning on the Jewish holiday of Yom Kippur in October of 1973. And that war started out very well for the Arabs. The Israelis had badly miscalculated. I mean, not just the Yom Kippur holiday when those Israeli troops, of course, were home enjoying the festive occasion, but also because Israel's intelligence had calculated that Israel still had air superiority and had more and better tanks than the Arab states did. Until the Arabs could contest them on the ground and in the air, the Arabs would be crazy to launch an attack. What they didn't calculate was that Soviet anti-tank missiles and Soviet anti-air missiles would neutralize Israel's advantage, and that's exactly what they did for the first few days of the Yom Kippur War. But it was only the first few days. There was a massive supply effort by the United States to replace Israel's lost equipment. That supply effort and Israel's own gallantry turned the tide within a few days, and so decisively, in fact, that Israel not only had not lost much territory, but had pressed against Egypt so hard that an entire Egyptian army had been virtually surrounded by the Israeli military and was in danger of being completely obliterated. And that's exactly what Israel meant to do. The Israelis were furious over this treacherous Arab attack that had caused many Israeli casualties, and they said, we're going to repay in kind, and in more than in kind. And that was intolerable not just to Sadat, but to Brezhnev. Sadat immediately approached Brezhnev and said, you can't allow the Israelis to completely destroy an entire Egyptian army. And Brezhnev says, you know, you're right, this would be a tremendous defeat in the Cold War for the Soviet Union. And so Brezhnev, who privately wanted to tell Sadat, I told you so, bad idea to attack Israel, even with all the Soviet equipment. He didn't do that. But he couldn't tolerate another Arab humiliation like 1967. So what to do? The first thing Brezhnev did was go on the phone to Henry Kissinger. Said, hey, you got to put the screws on Israel so that they don't obliterate that Egyptian army, because we, the Soviet Union, we can't permit that. So you get on the phone to the Israelis and say, hey, lay off. But it didn't appear as though the Israelis were laying off. And in fact, the matter was, a ceasefire was arranged, but it only lasted a few hours. Nobody's certain, who fired the first shot, but if you think about it, there are pretty strong motives on that side. And Brezhnev's furious. He said, Kissinger's betrayed me. He's not put the screws on Israel hard enough. So he sent a second communication directly to Kissinger and said, okay, if we can't trust the Israelis to obey the ceasefire, we have to insert a peacekeeping force between the Egyptian army and the Israeli forces. And I propose that we have joint Soviet-American forces. Just put themselves in between the two and enforce a ceasefire. For Kissinger, that was bad enough. Brezhnev also, because he was really angry with Kissinger, inserted a last-minute sentence and said, and if you don't agree to do this, if you won't agree to insert American forces alongside Soviet forces, I'm sending Soviet forces in. I'll do it myself. And we'll enforce a ceasefire that way. And now we get to the brink, because Kissinger said, I can't permit that. And time is of the essence when we're really talking about hours here before that Egyptian army might be obliterated. And the Soviet Union, they've already mobilized their paratroopers. And Kissinger's saying, I have no idea, that it might just be minutes before those Soviet troops get on the planes and they start landing in the Middle East. I can't allow that. Does anybody know why I'm talking about Kissinger and not Nixon, who actually was the president in 1973? That's my pop quiz. Anybody know why? A little thing called Watergate. Yeah. Nixon is in a drunken stupor. He is in a drunken stupor in the White House. He's incoherent. Kissinger and the other people have done a Trump. They have removed the nuclear strike codes from Nixon's possession, right? Because they're worried. about what Nixon might do because Nixon thinks the world's out to get him. Well, a lot of people were out to get him, but Kissinger didn't want. So Kissinger is essentially acting as president of the United States during this entire crisis. So that's why I'm talking about Kissinger. Kissinger says, okay, Brezhnev, he's brilliant. He might move within minutes. I've got to do something. And what Kissinger does is send a worldwide nuclear alert to American forces. Puts them on Defense Condition 3. There are 5 defense conditions in the American military structure. DEFCON 5 is the lowest of those, it's peacetime. DEFCON 1, we don't even want to think about. But DEFCON 3 prepares American nuclear forces for a possible nuclear war. All training exercises are halted. Service members are called back to their active duty units. American strike aircraft are dispersed from their bases, so that it's harder to take them out. American nuclear submarines leave port. Right? They collect their crews and they sail out of harbor. This is a global signal, and this is for American global forces, and that's what Kissinger orders. Why is he ordering that? Because he's worried the time is of the essence. He's got to send a signal to Brezhnev, don't you dare send Soviet troops in the Middle East, or else, and the or else is quite clear, right? The Americans have already gone to Defense Condition 3. Kissinger is looking for a way to immediately signal Brezhnev, we mean it. Don't send a single Soviet soldier in, and this going to DEFCON 3, this worldwide nuclear alert, Kissinger reasons, is one way to signal that to Brezhnev. But Kissinger clearly meant to signal that to Brezhnev, but he also signaled it to just about everybody else on the planet. You can't hide a global nuclear alert. Right? And, well, I just have a couple of interesting anecdotes to illustrate that. There was an American Air Force airman who got the nuclear alert. He said, I got to get to my base. So he hops in his car and he lights out at top speed, and a policeman pulls him over. And the guy was speeding. So the cop goes up to the airman and says, okay, give me your reason why. And the airman says, it's a nuclear alert. And the cop says, oh, that's really good. I've heard them all now. And the airman says, well, call my base. And they'll verify it. Cop calls the base. And the base commander says, yes, there's a nuclear alert. And the cop lets the airman go. Okay, by the way, put yourself in cop place on that. Another story is from somebody you might know, Stephen Sanfilippo, Stony Brook alum. And I was exchanging letters with him recently. He had this to say, so I'll just read his comments directly. During the Yom Kippur War, I was stationed at NATO military headquarters in Norfolk, Virginia, on the communications staff of Supreme Allied Commander Atlantic. I was way above top secret. At the height of the nuclear threat, I was able to get a phone line out to Susan, his wife. All I said was, I won't be home. She knew what I meant. We expected a nuclear attack on Norfolk. I kept my mouth shut about how close we came for over 40 years, but looking at the bright side, I was supposed to go to Subic Bay, Philippines for duty off the coast of North Vietnam. Instead, I was kept in Norfolk. Of course, there wasn't a nuclear strike on Norfolk. But Mr. Sanfilippo, that U.S. airman, not to mention the cop that pulled him over, were all scared out of their wits. Holy cow, it's a nuclear alert. And it wasn't just them. The various heads of state in Europe, the NATO heads of state, they got Kissinger. And they said, what is going on? I don't know what Brezhnev said, or if he had really bad breath that day, but a global nuclear alert for all American forces, what is going on? And it wasn't just the NATO heads of state either. The American military itself, military heads were baffled by this. What's Kissinger doing here? The American Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean, right off the coast of where the Yom Kippur War was being waged, had already gone to DEFCON 2. Right? They were fully ready for nuclear exchanges. They were expecting some tangles with the Soviet Mediterranean fleet. And his commander, we now know, actually sent an urgent message back to Washington saying, I received an order to go to DEFCON 3. I'm already at DEFCON 2. Should I go down to DEFCON 3? Kissinger hadn't thought about that. He was just worried about sending the signal to Brezhnev. And of course, the Soviet warships in the Eastern Mediterranean, who knew that the American warships were already on DEFCON 3, they're saying, oh, cow, now they're going to a global nuclear alert. We better get our missiles ready to strike those American ships. course, the person that was most directly affected was Brezhnev himself. Oh yeah, he got the signal all right. But what he asked was, is Henry Kissinger just as crazy as drunken Nixon? I mean, the issues of the Middle East, yes, they're important. Right? Yeah, they're of top concern, but they're worth World War III? They're worth obliterating the planet over? And Brezhnev said, I'm not going to play this game. I'm not going to issue a nuclear alert to Soviet forces, and I'm not going to send Soviet troops into the Middle East. And so, once again, you step back from the brink. But it was not a step back without consequence, any more than stepping back from the Cuban Missile Crisis was without consequence. Brezhnev felt betrayed by Kissinger, not just over restraining the Israelis, but over détente in general. He was under pressure from his own hardliners. He said, Brezhnev, you're a fool to believe in détente with the Americans. They're out to get us, just like Karl Marx said. And you fell for it. And Kissinger pulled the wolves over his shoulder, and guess what happened? We got humiliated in the Middle East once again. And Brezhnev had to agree. He said, yeah, okay, you're right. We better back away from détente. And you see a sharp decline in American-Soviet cordiality in the wake of the 1973 Young World War. A decline that led, in a way, quite directly to the third brink that I want to talk about. 10 years later, October 1983, the Able Archer exercises in Western Europe of that year. And to lead up to that point, I'll simply pick up where I just left off. A steady deterioration in American-Soviet relations through the balance of the 1970s, culminating with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan at the end of the 1970s. And President Jimmy Carter, he said, you know, I can't appear soft on communism, and so the Americans are not going to attend the 1980 Olympics. He did a lot more than that. He had grain embargoes and a few other things. But it really plunged American-Soviet relations into a new low by the end of the 1970s and helped elect Ronald Reagan to the White House. Because Reagan, campaigning on the slogan of "Let's make America great again," that was his slogan in 1980. And that was his message as well, and it resonated with the American voters quite successfully. Reagan was elected President of the United States, and he resolved that he was going to stand up to this now increasingly hostile Soviet Union. And he began his own American defense buildup. You know, 1970s were characterized by, Soviet buildup to equivalency with the United States, and we're not going to tolerate that. We're going to restore American supremacy. We're going to restore it through a number of ways. The first way is we're going to build a new generation of American attack missiles. We're going to update Minuteman to make it bigger, faster, and deadlier. Each new American missile will be able to hold 10, maybe a dozen, maybe 20 nuclear warheads alone. We're going to build better nuclear warheads to put on these missiles. We're going to put a new generation of American missiles into Europe, shorter range missiles that can be launched from Europe. They could hit Moscow in 6 minutes. From launch in Western Europe to Moscow, 6 minutes. That's how long the Soviets are going to have to think about what they want to do in response. So Reagan, he really tightens the screws. But the tightest screw that he puts in the Soviet blood, not the tightest screw, but let me back up for a moment. Reagan talks, he doesn't just act, he talks. He castigates the Soviet Union, he refers to the Soviet Union as the evil empire. There's Reagan's exact words, that's injurious. If you're Soviet, you're called the evil empire. This is the time, by the way, when Star Wars comes out. Brezhnev said, I'm not Darth Vader. Come on, I'm a human. The Soviets are hurt by all this. They're alarmed by what Reagan's doing with this great buildup, but then comes Reagan's trump, Star Wars. No, not the movies. The anti-missile systems. It was called technically Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI. But everybody called it Star Wars because that's when the movies were just coming out. And wow, what a marvel they were. I mean, they did have kind of a whiff of science fiction about them. They were supposed to be American battle stations put in space. Right? And these babies would be pumped, right? They would have X-ray lasers. I mean, even the name sounds cool, right? X-ray lasers that would be powered by atomic explosions, which meant they really would have a punch. They could only be used once, unfortunately, but they really have a punch. right? They would shoot down Soviet missiles as they left the atmosphere. So, hey, protect the United States. Strategic defense, right? We'll shoot down the Soviet missiles so they can't land here. Reagan believed deeply in SDI. He was appalled when he went to NORAD headquarters in Colorado, right? And was able to see, the big board, that tracks where all the Soviet missiles are, where they can land. Guys said, oh, we'll have a hypothetical launch and you can see what happens. Reagan's looking at the big board, he sees all these red dots appear over Chicago and New York and Los Angeles and so on. And Reagan says, can't you do anything about it? And the NORAD says, well, we can track them. We can see where they're going to go. And Reagan's appalled. And he's appalled by the whole idea of MAD. He says, well, that sounds to me like, two guys in a Western saloon with, 6 guns at each other's head and their fingers on the trigger. And sooner or later, somebody's got to go to the bathroom and they're going to pull the trigger and blow the other guy's head off, and they'll probably get their own head blown off. Reagan said, man, it's terrible, right? And SDI was the solution to it, right? You build a missile shield. So if the Soviets ever launch, you don't lose New York and Chicago, and so forth. Problem was that Reagan hadn't thought about the implications of SDI, particularly the implications on the Soviet side. Now, put yourself back in the Kremlin for a moment. Here's the United States building a new generation of offensive missiles, putting new missiles into Europe that can hit you in 6 minutes. And is maybe launching, the Soviets don't know, maybe the Americans could do this. Put a bunch of battle stations with lasers in orbit that can shoot down Soviet missiles. And if they can do that, what just happened to the Soviet Union? That's another pop quiz. The Soviet Union is well and truly screwed. So, if you're the Soviet Union and you're hypothetically, it's the eve of the Americans putting all their battle stations in orbit, what do?
Under the table.
It's World War III time, right? Because the Americans are going to rule the world once those battle stations are up there. Well, the Soviets they're sincerely worried about this possibility, and although the leaders of the Soviet Union are kind of getting on in years, the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, the crisis, was a fellow called Yuri Andropov, who had been a KGB chief. It was his job to say, to find out, are the Americans preparing to launch a first strike against the Soviet Union? And so what Andropov proposed was a specific operation, codenamed Ryan, R-Y-A-N, that would charge all Soviet intelligence apparatus, all intelligence organizations, for looking for signs that the Americans were readying a first strike against the Soviet Union. And the Soviets, Andropov was old enough to remember another first strike, not with weapons, of course, when the Nazis had attacked the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, in June of 1941, and the Soviets had been caught completely unawares. Devastating for World War II was for the Soviet Union. Andropov said, not on my watch. We're not going to allow anybody, including the United States, to go. So Operation Ryan, look out for what the Americans are doing. Because if we get wind that they're getting ready to launch a real first strike, by God, we're launching too. Right? We're not going to go down without a fight. Well, you can understand why Andropov might endorse Operation Ryan. The problem is that Andropov didn't figure out is if you create special routines, if you charge, in fact, special officers, your job is to look for signs of American first strike, well, guess what's going to happen? They're going to find signs of American preparations for a first strike because that's their job. Right? That's the assignment. So they're going to send back, oh yeah, I see light on at the Pentagon late at night. Could be, right? We better be prepared for that. And the Kremlin starts amassing these roomfuls of intelligence. Yes, the Americans are preparing to launch a first strike against the Soviet Union. And in this environment, the Americans engage in a series of operations that seem to confirm that they indeed are preparing a first strike against the Soviet Union. In April of 1983, the United States Navy held the largest maneuvers in the Pacific since World War II. And those maneuvers were held right off the coast of the Soviet Union, off the Sea of Okhotsk, They carried out simulated raids on Soviet bases along the Pacific coast with active probes, not simulated, active probes of Soviet radar defenses where American aircraft would approach Soviet airspace, force the Soviets to turn on their radars, and they would probe where the net was weakest, right, by flying up to the border and then flying away, okay? That was the object of the exercise. Well, as a way to probe Soviet defenses, that's a completely understandable exercise. But in the atmosphere in the Kremlin, what's that look like? That looks like the Americans are getting ready for a launch. And it wasn't just the American Navy. The United States Air Force had groups that were approaching Soviet polar airspace right across the North Pole, doing exactly the same thing, trying to test where Soviet radar gaps existed. And so Andropov, aware of this, issued a standing order. Any unidentified aircraft entering actual Soviet airspace is to be shot down. You don't have to ask Moscow for authorization. You just shoot that baby down. It's over Soviet airspace. It's unidentified, it's over Soviet airspace, missiles away. And that is exactly what happened September of 1983 to Korean Airlines 007. En route from New York to Seoul, South Korea. There was no GPS in 1983, right? So there's no global positioning system, satellites that can tell you where you are. Aircraft at the time used an automated inertial guidance system that required manual entry. When the aircraft took off, you had to manually enter the start locations and your flight plan. The flight engineer had to put all those numbers in by hand. The best that we know to date, and I don't think there's going to be any new evidence out on this, is the flight engineer for K8L007 probably put in the wrong numbers. And the autopilot took the plane well off course, far to the east, where it actually crossed Soviet airspace, went back into international airspace, and then re-entered Soviet airspace. And to the Soviet Union, what did this look like? It looked like another U.S. Air Force probe of Soviet radar defenses. Even then, the local Soviet commander who sent jets up to intercept this unidentified aircraft, he did call back to Moscow and said, do I have permission to shoot? And the Soviet commanders in Moscow thinking, oh man, if we don't shoot this thing down, what are we going to tell them to drop out in the morning? Right? The standing order was there. They said, well, of course you shoot it down. And they did shoot it down. It was a civilian airline that was shot down. An American congressman, member of the Republican Party, of course, right, was on board that plane and lost his life. And the American government was outraged. Said, we said Eagle Empire? Take a look. Civilian aircraft shot down, cold by the Soviet Union. But what the Americans really should have been outraged about was the terrible state of Soviet air defenses and why that had led Andropov to issue the order in the first place. The Soviets were worried. They were scared badly about the possibility of a successful American first strike against them. Their radars were old, as the whole episode proved to the Soviets. My God, we had problems finding a civilian airliner that was not even trying to evade us. That's how bad our air defenses are. And the Soviet military chiefs were saying, wow, thank God for Operation Rhine. We've got to keep our eyes out. We've got to be even more alert. So all of these things building together. And here comes Able Archer in October and November of 1983. Now, Able Archer itself was just a game. It was just a simulation. It was a communications exercise that saw various people in NATO, not just the United States, sending messages back and forth, simulating a Soviet attack on Western Europe, right, and trying to kind of war game out an American response to that Soviet attack. But Able Archer, although it was just a simulation itself, took place within wider NATO exercises, Autumn Forge 83, and a communications game, another war game, based on a hypothetical Soviet attack on Yugoslavia that would lead to a crisis within NATO, and then eventually a Soviet attack on West Germany. And this was really, this wasn't just a bunch of guys sitting around a table, having fun, pushing cardboard chits around, rolling dice and that kind of thing. On the second day, I'll just give you one example. On the second day, The word came from the master of the war game to a bunch of American Air Force personnel. Hey, your base has just been gassed, chemical gas, and for the balance of this exercise, you got to wear chemical gear. I don't know if any of you have ever put on anti-chemical gear. It's really uncomfortable. Right? Like the gas mask, only it's for your whole body, and right, this is not in the winter, so you really feel uncomfortable, and that's deliberate, right? It's meant to build stress, into the game, into the system. Well, it might have been realistic for the American Air Force guys, but remember, it's Operation Ryan. The Soviets are following all of this, and they're following it very closely. And yes, they're intercepting the NATO communications. And yes, NATO is careful. Before every communications, the NATO says in clear, exercise. This is an exercise. And the Soviets are saying, yeah, right. It's an exercise. We only have these naval maneuvers. We only have these Air Force probes, and so forth. But at that moment, as the Soviets are picking this up, Able Archer, right, the team of Able Archer, they say, okay, things are so bad from the Soviet invasion of West Germany, we're going to have to contact Washington and get authorization for a full-scale nuclear launch against the Soviet Union. And the Soviets pick this up. Yeah, NATO guy said exercise before setting that request, but the Soviets are saying, oh my God, here it is, it's the real thing. And as if to confirm it's the real thing, on November 8th, 1983, NATO changes its codes. Had never done that before during one of the autumn exercises, which occurred always every autumn. At this time, NATO changed its codes, and Ronald and Nancy Reagan leave Washington, D.C., ostensibly on a trip to Japan, which in fact is where they were going. But for the Soviet Union, how do they read that? Oh, it's the Reagans getting out of town because they know that we might get off a spare shot against Washington. So the Soviet Union puts its military on nuclear alert. Soldiers are recalled from the harvest. That might sound trivial, but that's a big deal for the Soviet Union. Always struggling with its agriculture, always needed as much manpower, literally in the fields as possible, for the Red Army to be called back to active duty, which really means losing a lot of the harvest. That's a pretty big deal. Soviet nuclear weapons were transferred from their storage sites to their operational units in the field. This is not a drill. The Soviets are getting ready for the big thing, and the Kremlin authorizes Soviet unit commanders to launch their weapons upon immediate confirmation of a NATO launch. So the Soviets are really on the hair trigger because of the environment, these earlier things that have been built up through 1983. Able Archer continues oblivious to all this. Does not know what the Soviets have done, and the day after the codes are changed, November 9th, 1983, the Able Archer headquarters sends out confirmation. The heads of state have approved a full nuclear launch against the Soviet Union. Prepare to send out the launch codes to American operational units. Now, they said exercise before they sent that message, but Operation Ryan immediately relays this to Andropov. And he has the real launch codes. He's not playing a game here. Now, again, background. In November of 1983, between the two of them, the United States and the Soviet Union have 18,400 nuclear warheads. So we're talking about a major launch. But it doesn't happen. 2 days later, November 11th, Able Archer ends. NATO had detected parts of the Soviet alert but had not put the pieces together on just how close the world had been to nuclear disaster. They did figure it out later on, and they figured it out from two very different sources. One was very secret. There was a Soviet agent who had been turned by the British intelligence agency, MI6, who basically, during and after Able Archer, said, you guys don't know how close you came. Because I've still got my contacts back in the Kremlin, and they were scared out of their wits. Right? The Soviets almost launched over this. You guys had them scared so badly. You got to put all the pieces together and figure out what kind of mindset you put them in. Right? And gradually, this double agent is able to persuade Britain and the British to turn to the Americans and say, hey, we kind of ran a risk there. We were pretty close to it. The other way of figuring out was very public. It was actually an American television show that some of you might have watched in 1983. It was called The Day After, and it depicted Jason Robards was the central character in it. He played a doctor in Lawrence, Kansas, which had been devastated by a nuclear exchange. Right? The movie starts with a big mushroom cloud going up over Lawrence, Kansas, and then it rapidly turns into a horror story when the survivors try to survive and have a real hard time about it. The American public itself relays their concerns about, hey, how close to a nuclear war are we? And Reagan kind of figures this out. Oh my God, maybe we did scare the Soviets a bit too much. And this really results in a change in Reagan's approach to the Soviet Union. He had rigorously refused to meet with our leaders beforehand. But in 1984, and in part because he was up for re-election, he was concerned about being portrayed as a cowboy in this. You see Reagan, trying to contact Andropov, and Andropov dies, and then Chernenko, and he dies, and then Gorbachev, who lives, is still around for a while. Reagan starts to reach out and will orchestrate summit conferences with the Soviet Union. And from the summit conference, Reagan himself learns, oh gee, we did come pretty close in 1983. So those are the 3 times of the brink. Now let's see how well the 2 major theories hold up, and then see if I can come up with something else that would better explain what's going on. Well, you might have noted that when I talked about all 3 of those, I barely mentioned deterrence. Kissinger wasn't thinking about it in 1973. The Americans weren't even aware that there was a nuclear crisis or a brink in 1983. And Andropov, he wasn't thinking about deterrence. He was worried about a real, honest-to-God, successful American first strike. Deterrence, I don't think, explains why we avoided World War III over the past 74 years. Nor do I think this idea of revulsion, moral abhorrence of nuclear weapons. It's not something that Khrushchev thought about when he sent missiles into Cuba. It's certainly not something that Kissinger considered, right, when he ordered the American nuclear alert. Brezhnev was surprised, but he certainly wasn't revolted by the possibility. He just said, Kissinger's nuts. I don't know what's going on over there in Washington, Watergate, and so forth, but the moral revulsion is not a factor. And in 1983, I think the supreme case of it, the Americans are not aware, there's no moral consideration there because there's no awareness there's a nuclear crisis there. The Soviets were deeply aware, but you search the Soviet archives in vain for someone going to Andropov and saying, this really would be a morally repulsive thing to do. It just isn't there. Right? There's this deep concern. That's why the nuclear weapons were in the field. That's why Andropov says, don't wait for Moscow. As soon as NATO launches, you launch. And we have ample testimony from Soviet military officers, most of them retired by now, of course. They had no problems. If they got that launch order, it was fire away. Right? Nobody was going to hold back. So I don't think the moral revulsion very successfully explains what's going on either. So okay, that's pretty unsatisfying. Gee, we can't explain why we didn't do a nuclear war the past 74 years. What was going on? What lessons of the past can we draw from these 3 brinks? Well, for one thing, all 3 began in October, but I don't think that gets us very far. On the other hand, though, we have to understand that in none of those 3 crises was the leadership of either the United States or the Soviet Union prepared to contemplate a full-scale nuclear first strike on the other's homeland. Kennedy was ready for a conventional airstrike, non-nuclear airstrike on Cuba. Yes, that's true. He did order measures to limit American vulnerability if World War III did break out. That's true. But Kennedy never, even when the United States had clear nuclear superiority, Kennedy never even thinks about, hey, it's time to go. Now, Curtis LeMay did think about it, by the way. LeMay did say, hey, we got him by the short hairs, let's finish him off here. And Kennedy, he's kind of aghast by this. Kennedy doesn't think about full scale. And Khrushchev, who really didn't have much to fire at the United States anyway, he's not even thinking about it, not in either case. The Yom Kippur War, 1973. Kissinger, he's not even thinking about seriously attacking the Soviet Union. He's sending a signal by ordering an American nuclear alert to the Soviet leadership over Middle Eastern questions. And that's Kissinger's concern. Oh, I don't really mean to ready for a nuclear strike. I just want to warn you off. Kissinger's not seriously considering it. But it's one that baffles Brezhnev. He says, well, what am I to make of this? You're not seriously considering a nuclear strike, but you order nuclear preparations? So you're sending me a signal and then saying the signal's not real? I mean, Brezhnev's just saying, what's going on here? But one thing that is clearly not going on is neither Kissinger nor Brezhnev were contemplating a first strike on the other side. Abel Archer, 1983. The Americans, they're not contemplating the actual strike. Right? They're just having exercises to make the Soviets think so. And Reagan says he's oblivious to this possibility. He might think the Soviet Union is an evil empire. It doesn't mean to launch an American nuclear first strike against it. Well, we know that for sure because later on when Gorbachev says, well, hey, your SCI threatens the nuclear balance, it threatens mutually assured destruction. Reagan says, oh, I'll share it with you. That's exactly what Reagan said. I'll share the technology with you so that we'll both be protected. And Gorbachev said, this guy played poker? Does he expect me to take this seriously? Reagan actually meant it seriously. But what Reagan certainly didn't mean is an American nuclear first strike against the Soviet Union. And although Andropov was deeply worried about an American first strike, you don't see in the Soviet records either Andropov saying, well, what we really ought to do is launch a first strike against the United States before they have a chance to launch a first strike against us. Right? Andropov, he's deeply worried, but he does not authorize the use of Soviet nuclear weapons. So in all three of these brinks, but especially in the latter two, the real danger, it seems to me, was not that anybody intended to cause a nuclear war, but they were intent on sending signals or reading signals, and they usually misread them pretty badly. They didn't really get the signal correctly. So what's the lesson of the past? What's the lesson of these three brinks? Here it is, and I'm afraid it's not going to be very reassuring in the present environment. When leaders of nations feel threatened by other nations or leaders, they will act on that threat, whether the threat exists in reality or not. They will do so regardless of considerations of deterrence. They will do so regardless of feelings of moral revulsion. When leaders make threats or act in a way that can be seen as threatening, they should understand that they make the international environment far more risky, far more subject to miscalculation or just plain accident. The stakes are high, especially in a world with multiple nuclear powers, and I fear that leadership in many nations have not learned the lessons of the three brinks. Thank you very much. As ever, I'm willing to take questions.
I'm surprised that you didn't talk about General MacArthur, the Korean War, and the risk of renegade military commanders and the necessity for creating the safeguards in the process of the nuclear codes and the whole processes that evolved after the Korean War.
Yeah, this is a possibility that President Truman took quite seriously. And fortunately for Truman, the Joint Chiefs of Staff took quite seriously and took what steps they could to ensure that MacArthur or commanders under him could not violate, to cross a threshold that would risk war with the Soviet Union or China. Mistakes were made, and I haven't talked about the many nuclear accidents and near misses, like fail-safe simulated in the movie, that could have occurred. But just to use one example, there was an American raid on a Soviet airfield during the Korean War. American jets attacked the Soviet airfield, caused Soviet casualties. Stalin was the leader of the Soviet Union at that time, not exactly a kind man, but he understood. I mean, he doesn't consider a retaliation. By 1950, the Soviets had nuclear weapons in that case. So Truman was deeply aware of that problem. Ironically, since you raised the point of Korea, President Eisenhower, who replaces Truman, is quite willing to consider the use of battlefield nuclear weapons to force the Chinese to the negotiating table. He's quite willing to consider that. It turns out he doesn't have to consider that because the real obstacle to a final armistice was not China, it was South Korea that refused to sign on to terms until the Americans put the screws on that. But your point is certainly well taken.
As the present development of hypersonic missiles, is this going to have an effect on the equation as to what posture to be taken?
Yeah, it basically means that the things that Andropov was worried about in 1983 now have to be worried about on a global scale. In other words, it's not just Moscow that's worried about, we got a 6-minute window. When the Americans launch from West Germany and Italy, we've got 6 minutes to decide. Is this a false alert? And we just let it go and oops, Moscow was obliterated and we're dead? Or is it a real American launch, in which case we better launch our missiles before the Americans hit them in the silos? Now, if you've got intercontinental missiles capable of a very rapid delivery, that window of consideration, right? The time you have to figure out, is this just a blip? Right? Is it a false alarm or is it for real? That window shrinks quite rapidly. So yeah, we should be worried.
In your estimation, what do you think we should make of what Mr. Trump is doing with respect to Iran and the nuclear issue? And is whatever he's doing on behalf of his own quirks or dispositions or on behalf of the United States of America?
Right. Well, I can only give you my personal opinion. So
That's what I'm asking.
So here it is. I think the British ambassador had it exactly right. Exactly right. Trump pulled out of the deal because it was a way to spite Obama. I think Trump gave zero consideration to what comes afterwards. We'll get a better deal. Well, how? What's your plan? I don't think Trump has a plan. He has a tweet, but there's no plan. There's no way of getting from A to B, much less A to D. I mean, Trump, he's very good at playing checkers. It's a chessboard out there, and I don't think he understands, what a dangerous game he's playing. What he has done is he has done to the Iranian leadership, much more deliberately, what Reagan did unwittingly to the Soviet leadership in 1983. I mean, Trump has basically said, we're out to get you guys. And wow, what a surprise, the Iranians say, in a rather measured fashion, I must say, well, we're going to breach the nuclear storage thresholds now as a way of saying, well, unless we get this sorted out, we're going to eventually build atomic weapons. Right? And Trump he's done a very good job of painting himself into a corner, once the Iranians take that step. Right? Because he's got there's no plan B. Right? There's no other move. I mean, I don't think he understands diplomacy at all, because diplomacy is not business. You get into a bad business deal, you just say, okay, I declare bankruptcy, I walk away. No harm done. You can't do that in the world. I'll just ignore Iran. You can't wish it away. You've got to deal with the international environment that you inherit. I still think Trump does not understand that.
Thank you.
In today's world, is there any role for arms control treaties? We've already backed out of a couple. The Soviet Union just backed out of a couple. Recently, President Putin, when he was being interviewed with the Financial Times, had said that he was more than willing and interested in re-establishing negotiations for the upcoming treaty, which is going to be ending in 2021. He also indicated that he had not had any positive response from the United States. So where do we stand in terms of the overall production? I mean, we've gone completely nuts. We're spending over $1 trillion. Soviet Union is supposedly getting into hypersonics at a level that maybe even we're not. I mean, how do we stop that?
Well, I'll give you a prosaic answer, and maybe an overly simplistic one for a very complex question, but it'll echo my response to you. You need, in order to have arms control negotiations, you need an arms control negotiation team, and you need one with direction from the top. And you haven't got either of those in Washington currently. diplomatic experts have frankly been leaving the service in droves. That is a brain gap that is going to exist for a long time. That's really serious damage to American capabilities to engage with the rest of the world. And that is, arms control is one good example of that loss of capability. We've got a Secretary of State who's more interested in, I don't know what, inalienable human rights that apparently means, no abortions worldwide. I think that's what Pompeo is targeting, and has got no clue as to what there might be some other diplomatic issues out there that are important for American national interests to deal with, but you need attention from the top, and you've not got that currently. Is there a place for arms treaties? Yes. There's no question about that, and Putin himself, I'm sure, is aware of Soviet arms control veterans who would be willing to step into it and strike a good deal for, well, now the Russian Federation, not the Soviet Union, but the veterans of those negotiations. And there are veterans in the United States as well, but nobody's interested in hearing what they have to say. So, yes, sir.
Can you give us a sense of where you see us going in the next 2 or 3 years?
A lot depends on what happens in November of 2020. I think that you don't want to say, you slide off the cliff, if Trump is reelected, because you never know. People were saying that in 1983, to be perfectly honest. They were saying that about Reagan, saying, here's a guy, here's a movie actor, he doesn't understand the complexities of office, he doesn't understand what words like evil empire, what injury they do in international relations, and Reagan proved it wrong. I mean, he kind of figured it out in his second term. So who knows? Maybe Trump can figure it out if he's reelected. I think pigs might also fly, but it is a possibility out there. If you get a change of administration in 2020, then things look very different indeed. You might get a restoration of veterans back in Washington, actually, what they're doing, and a new sense of how to unburn bridges that have been burned in the past couple of years. Yes?
Yes, I would like to know your opinion on the future of the nuclear triad. I understand they extended the life of B-52s, B-2s. Now we're replacing the Trident-class submarines with Columbia-class. What is the future of the Minute Threes? Do you see them replacing them or removing them from the triad in the next 20 years?
Right. I think that the missile component and the submarine component are quite secure in American strategic doctrine for as far as you can see into the future. I know Air Force veterans would be pained to hear this, but I think the future of the manned bomber is very much up in the air. I mean, I know there have been successors to the B-52, many of them, in fact, but it seems to me that if you do a McNamara style cost-benefit analysis, you're probably better off with just 2 legs of that triad. If I had to bet, that's how I'd bet the future's going to turn out. Big difference.
Thank you very much, Michael. Why are you not in Washington? They need you. Anyway, that was interesting, sobering, fascinating. Thank you all for coming, and thank you, Michael, for another wonderful talk here at the library.